I'm going to introduce our first presenter, who is Rachel Campbell. Rachel, where are you? Oh, there you are. She's gone. Who is going to be presenting on the topic of church gossip. Now, how many of you have ever been gossiped about? Well, if you haven't, you must be pretty boring. Okay? Okay. All right, how many of you have ever gossiped? Well, Rachel hails to us from PEI, where I am sure there is absolutely no gossip. And so, here is Rachel to air the dirty laundry of the church.
Thank you so much. Before we begin, I would like to ask you to pray with me. Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, let the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, dear Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I was about 5 years old when my mother's father passed away. I remember people from our church and community traveling down our red dirt road. They carried endless Tupperware dishes with containers identified with names scrawled in black permanent marker. Word had gotten around that there was an upheaval within our community, the loss of a family member. And people responded in that lovely, true to PEI fashion, with food. That time, the gossip was not fueled by anything but good intent. The sharing of sad news to muster up community support. A few years later, at the age of 12, I was told that my brother was diagnosed with HIV. In 1988, there was a veil of fear around HIV in our society, driven by an ignorance, even hate. As a 12-year-old, I feared that word would get out. I feared for my brother. I wanted to protect my brother. I wanted to protect me. The likelihood of gossip becoming malicious was real, driven by a fear of the unknown. So gossip, is it prophetic or is it profanity? Gossip can be a noun, a verb, and even an adjective. Malicious gossip can do great harm. On the other hand, good gossip or positive gossip can be quite helpful. Author of Truths and Half-Truths, my friend Niels Ling, defined gossip as, in a small community, gossip is negotiable currency. It can be exchanged for tea and biscuits, social standing, and minutes in the spotlight. Within the Christian tradition, the sharing of good news orally was the historical method of receiving Scripture and receiving the law. From mouth to ear, word traveled. This network of communication was alive in the oral tradition. It was, in respects, an information communication highway of the earliest stories of the Christian faith. Maybe this is why the parables share that common tagline, "Let anyone with ears listen." And with that, the Christian community responded. This could explain why I found so many who brushed off church gossip as something that has always been done, a form of communication, a form of entertainment. They felt it cannot be changed. But what do we really know about gossip? Does gossip have a function within the structure of the church? All this brought me to my research question. How is one's faith and/or ministry affected by church gossip? The goals of this project were to explore the potential benefits and risks. I wanted to examine how gossip within the church community impacts the overall spiritual health of congregants, how it impacts ministry personnel, and in the end, how it affects the entire church structure. The methodology I chose began with a narrative process in order to gather data from participants of this study. The goal was to create a grounded theory. To recruit participants, I sent out notice and general invitations to various denominations. I asked them to put the notice in their bulletins, online notices, verbal announcements. I also created a YouTube video asking for participants. This received over 350 hits in less than 7 days. I interviewed a total of 7 participants between the ages of mid-20s to mid-60s. There were 4 women, Naomi, Sophia, Esther, and Elizabeth. There were 3 men, Matthew, Peter, and Daniel. Each participant selected his or her own biblical name and were either ministry personnel or a congregant. Participants had denominational backgrounds in Catholic, Anglican, United Church, Salvation Army, Presbyterian, and what one would call a bit of every church, because they church hopped for a bit and are currently in the Baptist denomination. Participants represented either rural or urban areas from a total of 4 provinces in Canada. Each participant was asked a series of 8 main questions during the 45-minute interview. These questions highlighted their personal understanding of gossip, how it functioned in the church, why it happened within the church, what it was like for them when they encountered church gossip, how it was handled, when it was helpful and harmful, did it affect the ministry leadership of their church, and had they ever partaken in church gossip themselves. But first, I did my homework to find out what was being or had been said about gossip by theologians, scholars, and the Bible. What was the buzz? Theologian and anthropologist Gerald A. Arbuckle, in his book, Violence, Society, and the Church, discusses the dynamics of gossip. He points out that gossip is an expression of a response to a narcissistic need for power over others. Assistant professor of the University of Baltimore, Sally D. Farley, presented a secular study of 128 people in her research paper, Is Gossip Power? She concluded that high-frequency gossipers who were negative gossipers were liked less. She found, though, that high-frequency gossipers still tended to have a lot of friends. She speculated that perhaps the high-frequency gossipers are welcomed into social networks for fear of others losing the opportunity to learn information. But they are kept at arm's length. American theologian Donald Capps, in his book Living Stories, states, even where gossip is not malicious or degrading of another person, the fact it supports exclusivity, favors in-groupism, and is entertaining, implies that it's more to be tolerated than valued. Its potential for malice or triviality outweighs its positive effects. Later, Donald Capps, in his paper, Gossip, Humor, and the Act of Becoming an Intimate of Jesus, considers the views of the social scientific research and literary studies on gossip that present a more complex picture of this form of communication. Capps makes a case for the importance of the trivial because of the similarities between gossip and narratives that comprise the Gospels, including they both have this aesthetic surfaces, and that the stories told derive their power from the freedom that the participants gain in conversation of entering into someone else's life through imagination. Within Scripture, there are many examples where we are warned against gossiping. James 3, likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. Consider what a great fire is set on fire by a small spark. Then in Matthew 10, there is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that would not be made known. What I tell you in the dark, speak in the daylight. What is said and whispered in your ear, proclaim from the roofs. The concept of owning and claiming what one says is an important concept within the Christian mission. Theologically, the teachings of Jesus made it clear how to deal with conflict openly, lovingly, but also very directly. This is reflected in Matthew 18. If another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. If the member listens to you, you have regained that one. But if you are not listened to, take one or two others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. This theological framework shows that being accountable is what you say is as important as what you do within Christian tradition. The early Christian community discussed in the New Testament, as in the book of Acts, highlights a community whose members cared for each other, kept each other accountable, and tried to live out the Christian faith and Christ's teaching in a transparent way. These aspects of Christian life then and now continue with the proclamation of the Word. And as such, we must communicate well in order for Christ's mission to continue. Participants shared their views openly. The data acquired went through a series of events to bring you here today to this presentation, and further to the finished 35 to 40-page paper due on March 25th. Let's see the process from interview to presentation unfold. There you have it, from interview to presentation in 39.62 seconds. What are we complaining about? Now, I invite you to sit with me at that interview table as I highlight some of the recurring themes that my participants shared about church gossip. Participants defined gossip in a very structured way. The term gossip was identified as a negative and malicious form of communication by my participants. Malicious church gossip was seen as secretive, with no regard for fairness or respect concerning the people that were being gossiped about. It was viewed by my participants as disrespectful and not of God, or a characteristic of Christ. However, the spreading of good news or good gossip could promote pastoral care and a sense of community belonging. With all this in mind, malicious gossip was mainly defined as a great sin, while good gossip, a form of pastoral care. The issue with it becoming malice was of great concern. Esther shares.
In the church, oh, it's huge. I've witnessed and experienced and had to deal with a lot of grief in regards to the hurt that people cause by gossip. Also in confronting lies about it, concerning myself or other people, because of the damage of the gossip and hurt and alienation, and because of the disconnect within the church. And it's across the board a lot of times. It's not like it could come from the pulpit, like the minister could be doing it, or it could be the old ladies that have nothing better to do than to talk on the phone, like on the party line.
Experiencing church gossip left participants feeling uneasy. Those who participate in church gossip may find it entertaining, and to be in the know does create a solidarity with other gossipers. This kind of relationship building, however, identifies a pecking order, where the ones that are in the know are at the top and feel superior. All of this creates alienation between those who are gossiped about, those doing the gossiping, and those who are not in the know. People are curious by nature. They like to show off. We all do. And gossip can be hard not to participate in, even when it is malice. Humans easily respond to information being given and received because it can be interesting. Peter stated,
It sounds a little sadistic, but I think there's part of us, in all of us, that we like to see someone else taken down a few pegs. If someone has a failure in their life, or we perceive it as a failure, we feel that, oh, my life can't be as bad as that. So I think there's a lot of that within the environment of a church, too.
The testing was real when the church gossip got malicious. Participants' faith in the church structure and its members was tested, and there was this great sense of disappointment and sadness within their faith community. The enormous amount of hurt created left participants feeling spiritually low, and the intentions of everyone in the church was questioned. Questions around where is God in association with church gossip came up when dealing with how one's faith was affected. The malicious act was not glorifying God. But what could one learn from it in order to work things out? There was this need to ask, what would Jesus say about this? However, no one could say that malicious church gossip affected their faith in or their relationship with God. Those participants who experienced malicious church gossip had memories still fresh in their mind. Naomi recalled,
I'm talked about a lot, apparently. Like, she's a show-off. She has a big mouth. She just does things for attention. That this is an act that she's so kind and always reaching out to people. At first, it hurt. But then I realized how Jesus was treated, and it doesn't hurt as much. Because the more we let our light shine and the more positive, I think we grow in spirit.
The maliciousness created cracks in the wall that began to divide what once stood solid. When participants encountered church gossip, they began to see people turn away from the church. The gauge between identifying good and bad gossip got blurred, so communication started to cease. This affected relationships within the church. However, others who saw this actively made it a point to talk openly about everything with one another. But they intentionally kept it out of malicious places. They didn't even like the term gossip because they felt the term carried a lot of baggage with it. People like Sophia and members that attended her church focused on care and response. Sophia shared,
I think that any little tidbits of what I hear are told to me in the manner that we look at ourselves as being people who are disciples of Christ, and that we look out for our neighbors and we look out for each other. I think part of our church identity as people of faith, we want others to see us as Christians, living out everyday gospel of looking out for each other. And I think that we want people to know us by our actions as much as by seeing us go to church on Sundays.
the handling of church gossip left participants offering some advice. For most participants, they witnessed in many instances gossip was handled in church by ignoring it. Some would even use the term covering it up. Participants felt that the church acted as compassionately as possible, but again, not enough care or instruction was provided for leaders when handling such situations, and then this was reflected in their response. Participants felt that gossip, when malicious, should be handled directly and openly, and people should be held accountable in a way that tries to affirm everyone. A common theme was the need to train church leaders through facilitated leadership workshops in dealing with malicious church gossip. It was felt there was a need to train leaders of the church on how to keep gossip positive, using gossip as a beneficial way of social communication and pastoral care. My participant, Elizabeth, named an act of malicious gossip in her church, and today is still struggling how it might have been handled differently. Elizabeth responded,
Well, I was very transparent about it, okay? I named it as gossip. I named it as malicious gossip, not in an angry way. In a, don't worry about this is malicious gossip, you know, consider it what it is. And the sad part about that is the person that was spreading the gossip looked stupid, looked bad, was ended up discredited. And I don't know how else to have accomplished it without rolling over and saying, here, destroy the parish. I don't know.
So how do we turn all this talk into good gossip? When discussing how good gossip could be useful, participants discussed many aspects of what they would define as good church. A good church was living in relationship with each other. Members were there for each other in hard times. The church promoted a spirit-giving culture that did the work of God and acted upon the teachings of Christ. They said the space is safe, where one could be vulnerable, and the tight-knit community was not an isolating community, but instead community-oriented, the doors open. Participants felt that this would give the church a better image and allow people to be accountable to each other as Christians in an affirming way. This was not about fluff, but a sincere community of believers that were supportive and accountable to each other on their faith journey. Sophia proudly claimed this reality for her own church community. Sophia expressed,
I would say that for me as a preacher, it has been really affirming in that we're not talking about people behind each other's backs. That is, if someone is having a hard time or that there's a care or concern that perhaps I'm not aware of, that someone will gently let me know what is going on. It just really affirms what we talk about at church as the need to be there for each other and to be there as a community of God's faithful.
so what happens when fear ceases all communication? One area that was brought up that affected ministry leadership was in places where church members refused to discuss anything for fear they were gossiping. The ministry leadership felt crippled by this. Participants in this situation felt they were living in a bubble, and the aloofness of the faith community in sharing information created a lot of stress. Ministers felt that they couldn't offer the care and concern in a proper pastoral response because they felt completely left out of the loop. No one was talking. The fear of gossiping made people just not talk to one another about anything. For Daniel, he felt in limbo. Daniel shared his information.
Being a rural setting, gossip happens over tea in people's living rooms. So the only way for me to be in the midst of it, in the midst of the conversations that were happening, is to spend basically every waking moment not in my own house. And I have so many other things going on that I can't afford to put that much effort into pastoral presence. I'm completely out of the loop, crippled. It's as if there is a bubble that exists around the manse, and I'm not able to leave that bubble because of my circumstances.
We've all done it. All participants confirmed that they had partaken in church gossip in both the negative and positive forms. There was a sense that this was a way of entertainment, especially when they were younger. But as they got older, they realized how using gossip in more positive ways was more of an overall benefit. Some felt that being the topic of malicious gossip allowed them to have empathy and to recognize it, to name it as malicious gossip, to slow it down and to stop it altogether, to be accountable. There was this newfound ownership in this realization to the point that I received a message earlier last week from one of my participants, and the email said this: "I did it. I named it. With compassion, I stopped malicious gossip in my church in its tracks, and we had a good conversation." Recognizing it and responding to it was a very important theme for my participants. But sometimes it's hard when you're caught up in the web. Matthew shared how he dealt with realizing he was partaking in church gossip.
Prayed, for one thing. I prayed, God, help me to not do this. Lord, help with this. I am a human and need your help, Lord. When I see myself slipping from my high Christian standards, which I do on occasion, I pray for guidance to be the way God wants me to be. And I also found the few times I did gossip, there is this sense of anger. You are talking about someone, and I'm not sure if the anger is making the guilt. I'm not made to be a gossip. I pay for it with guilt if I do gossip.
There are implications for the church and theology when church gossip is malicious. For one, it creates division. Christianity is about unity, and even though denominations don't see eye to eye on aspects of the Christian tradition, we all pray for unity as Jesus prayed in John 17. At the 41st General Council meeting of the United Church of Canada held in Ottawa, out of 130 proposals for action, one was taking a stand against spreading church gossip. A person who attended that meeting shared that when the gossip proposal was first announced, there was this lighthearted feeling within the assembly until the well-prepared proposal was presented. The court very much discerned over this proposal. The proposal was amended and carried with the following actions. 1. Encourage congregations to seek ways to raise awareness of the harmful aspects of gossip. And 2. Encourage congregations to open discussion regarding how to distinguish between gossip and a caring pastoral conversation. So are we doing that? What is our response? In the end, the theology of the Christian church is focused around a communal theology. We are to be as one, to be as community, a faith community that lives in a supportive, accountable, and well-communicated environment that reflects who Christ was and who Christ is. So what? How does church gossip affect one's faith and/or ministry? Can the results of these narratives bring us to a grounded theory? If we are not accountable, if we are not working as one, if we are maliciously tearing each other apart and not shedding a light on these situations, dealing with these situations, then my participants said, we are an unhealthy Christian church. This qualitative research study shows that how using the fine-tuned technique of gossiping for good communication, for pastoral communication, for productive communication, can actually aid the Christian community. This form of well-practiced communication is a technique that may just have a role within our church today. For me, that was exciting. The so what factor tells me when church gossip is malicious, name it. Deal with it. Empower Christians to support each other. Then they can bring that support from these pews out into the community. Isn't that what this is about? Invite others in, don't shut them out. Let us show that we are focused on a Christian church community that challenges each other, supports each other, and allows the attributes of God, our Creator, to shine through who we are and what we do. So, is church gossip prophecy or profanity? It's both. We need to look at the intent. That is the key that came in this research. What is the intent when sharing information with one another? Under that microscope, maybe we can truly love our neighbor as ourselves, and above all, love God with all our heart, our soul, and mind. Let's put aside those ways that no longer work and show ourselves in a new way that doesn't allow maliciousness to tear us apart. Instead, let us build up one another. All glory be to God. Amen.
See you in a minute. Questions and answers. And I wanted to recognize we have a great contingency of people here from St. Matthew's United Church, where Rachel is a student minister, so we welcome you. And I wondered if we want to have someone from St. Matthew's start us off with questioning.
Oh, they're not shy.
Start with some gossip.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, I got a
the
story to
latest
tell
gossip
you.
with St. Matthew's.
That's why we're all here, to make sure she doesn't say anything mean about it.
Oh, Helga.
I'm wondering if there is an actual strategy. I envision and probably have experienced situations where you share something that is negative and true, and it's construed as gossip when your intention is only to heal that situation, get at it, but until it's in the open, it can't. How do you deal with the misunderstanding that labels it as gossip when it's really information sharing?
Misunderstanding. One of the things that my participants talked about was the idea of sharing it directly with that person, and that is really hard to do. But is having communication, very similar in Matthew, where you one-on-one. That way there's less chance of us saying, well, Helga said this, and taking your intent being misunderstood. Your intent being something more that you want to deal with it. The idea of accountability is there's no way that we can be accountable if we don't know what someone is saying or how to deal with that. If someone has a complaint about me or about Dr. Wilhock or whoever, the best person to talk to would be to talk directly to that person. Then there's less chances of misunderstanding, but it is tough. One of the things my participants have talked about is the idea of training, of talking with people. What are the best ways that we can do this within our church? As we well know, there's not a denomination that doesn't have a gazillion committees. Wouldn't this be a great thing for those committees to talk about and to share? And that be something that can spread then those seeds throughout the entire congregation. That then will take away, will show your intent as being more pastoral and less malicious.
A little easier to say.
Then do.
I'd much rather run to my minister.
Yeah. That's why I wore this color scheme. Not everything is black and white. Sometimes it's gray.
Rachel, I'm wondering in your conversations, even around good gossip and its ability to facilitate good pastoral care within a community, if your participants had any conversation or you'd done any thinking about all of the recent privacy legislation that really impedes the sharing of any kind of pastoral knowledge, especially if it's come out of hospital settings and those kinds of places.
Yes, in settings, especially in hospitals and stuff, we do have to respect the policy laws, and we have to be very careful with that. Again, training, talking with people, what we can share. Actually, as part of my research, I did have a privacy lawyer on as one of my members of my team, because it is important to look into that, and to also to, and he's here. You want to answer that one? No. So it is important to look at the policies, look at what things are going on. And this is the whole idea, opening up communication, sharing proper communication, sharing properly. And in order to do that, you do also have to look at the privacy laws. That's a very good point. And actually, 3 of my participants brought that up and talked about that. And knowing your community as best that you can and knowing what's happening there. So thank you. Yes.
I realize that it's standing room only, and we do invite you all. There's some seats up here. I don't want folks to have to stand up unless that's your choice. Some seats here on this front row. So we'll fix that for the next. Any other questions?
I think Dr. Faber.
Rachel, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Wonderful. I was just wondering, on the whole in churches, there doesn't tend, maybe people will say that this is wrong, but there isn't a great acceptance of the doctrine of sin. And yet here's a practical instance where people acknowledge that this is sin. So I'm just wondering what can be learned about the doctrine of sin from this practical example.
I found that really interesting too. I heard that quite a bit in my interviews, is that this is a sin. This is a great sin, that as humans we sin. The doctrine of sin. We sin. That is the reality of it. And when we sin, then how do we respond to that sin? We respond to that sin in compassion, in accountability. But it's exactly that. I think that we have shied away from the idea that we can't talk about sin. But the reality of it is, if we don't talk about the ways in which we sin, then how can we then take into account God's grace for us and our grace for each other? If we're not talking about these things, if we're not talking about the things that are unpleasant, then how can we be an authentic, true community of faith? So I think we need to talk about it, and we do shy away from it, and we need to dig into those things that say that this is a sin, then how do we respond?
So it's the other side of it is, the other doctrine is anthropology. So how do we understand ourselves as persons?
Yes.
What is revealed by gossip about how we understand, it's related to the sin notion, but how we understand ourselves to be.
It's like putting a mirror up in front of our face and realizing then how our reactions and how we do react, and that's how we learn from that. And actually, that's why when I did my research, to have an anthropologist and to look at, an anthropologist who's also a theologian, was wonderful to be able to kind of dig into some of that information. But it's exactly that. I kind of compared it to when I was doing my research is, I put a mirror up in front of my face. And what are the things that I did not like that I need to respond to, and what are the things that, oh, I'm really happy about and proud of? So that type of thing. So I think that, again, open communication and being able to be brave enough to talk about those things.
You know, some of the theory of feminist theology and womanist theology is that gossip is a form of women's speech. That therefore, that's why it's been defamed. Because that's the way that women conducted their lives in conversation, and that get together on the front porch and chit-chat and chatter, and not meaning anything vicious by it, but because it was considered women's speech. And so that's where the, you know, the kind of devaluing of it came from. I don't know if you had.
Yeah, my participants, one of the things I wanted to point out, they did not say specifically that this is a thing that women did, or this is a thing that men did. It was very much, everyone does it. But in my research and looking at that, the tight-knit communities, be it, some of them talked about in feminist theology, is the quilting bees, those type of things, those conversations, and the idea that that was a place for them to have that communication to share between themselves. It's when it gets malicious, it's taken out and spread all over the place, that's when it becomes a problem. So it is a form, it's a very well-practiced form of social communication, and my participants pointed that out. Oh. Miss Molly.
You had to hear from me.
I'm waiting.
You're waiting. Well, when you first started, my first reaction is, our whole theology is based on gossip. 40 years after Jesus died, they started writing these stories. And so, gossip is good.
It's gotten a bad rap. Amen.
Thank you. Word from the wise.
Almost 91 years of wise.
Eberhard Bethke was a student of Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Yes.
Bonhoeffer, you may know as a person, was a leader in the confessing church or the resistance church during the Nazi era. And Bethke said when they went to seminary with Bonhoeffer in kind of the resistance seminary, they resolved not to speak of anyone who was not present.
Okay.
In the seminary. Just
wow.
wanted to note that, yeah. Bethke said, of course, we failed miserably. but the effort transformed our community.
Exactly. That's actually beautiful. That's one of my, Sophia, who I interview, basically the same idea, is that when they first try to just kind of stop talking in general, it changed the atmosphere the vibe, so that when they did communicate, they were able to communicate at a very positive places, or at least, I know you're struggling, you need help, and they were able to respond in a pastoral care. But I love that story. That's very beautiful. Thank you.
Rachel, thank you. That was lovely.
Thank you, Dean.
You're welcome. About a year ago, Bob Hemp gave me a book by Christopher Hitchens on mortality, which is his reflection on dying, which is really a fabulous book to read during Lent, I just want to say. So thanks, Bob. In the book, he talks a lot about his cancer. And he says cancer is dead. I mean, cancer is not a living entity. It's not. And I'm wondering about using kind of cancerous diagnostic tools or ways of understanding cancer as a way of seeing how it works, if in fact it operates that way. Because there is a malignancy to some kinds of
forms
gossip,
of cancer.
Right?
Gossip.
So,
Yeah,
and
right.
if you look at someone who, if there's destructive competitiveness, which is a neurotic structure inside someone, so if I want to assassinate somebody, and actually in your data you said, so there are people who fit into that category.
Yes.
If I want to assassinate Rob Fennell, I'll do that.
Yeah.
I may not in fact know that I'm doing it unconsciously. It's just that there's something about Rob I want to destroy, right?
Yes.
So, there's malignancy, and I've noticed that in the life of congregations. Then there's a kind of a benign cancer, which is really what you were talking about before, which is, did you hear that Rachel has to go to the hospital tomorrow just for tests?
Right.
And it's really benign. It's not meant to be at all. But now there's another kind, and I'm not sure about this category. It's if a person, let's say Pastor X, is a really bad pastor, right?
Yes.
No, really bad, and
Yes,
actually
yes.
killing a congregation.
Yep.
The congregation begins to talk about it. So a twinship transference begins to occur. So I might talk to you, Rachel, and say, what do you think of that sermon? You say, well, it wasn't very good, right? And then we slowly begin to develop this cluster and say, well, we have a critique about the ministry that's going on here. So how do you do, I'm looking at those categories and trying to figure out if that's another optic or another way of looking at it, because there are some gossips that are clearly malignant and they're vicious and they're going to cause death.
Yes.
There's some that seem benign,
yes.
and there are some that are in a different category altogether. Can you comment?
Sure. The ones in a category differently is actually what my participants talked about in the training, in understanding and recognizing that. Once again, we have committees. For example, if that was to happen within a United Church as an M&P, supposed to be, they're supposed to be an M&P. So allowing them to talk, that person to come and say, here's my feelings about that quote-unquote bad pastor, and then the proper communications. Here's when it becomes a problem. If you're not going through the proper communication channels, if you're not going to the proper committee for I want to fix this problem, here's my issue, then what's your intent? If your intent's not to truly fix the issue of my bad pastor, then what's your intent? So again, just what we had talked about, that idea of sin, putting the mirror back on ourselves.
Is it to get this person, or
yeah.
is it to get...
Is it a personality conflict to actually get this person to get Dr. Fennell, Or is it to actually, Dr. Fennell is really doing a crappy job, so I'm going to meet with him and talk with him about his crappy job, which you never do.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi,
social media received no mention in your talk. I wonder if you would like to comment on that.
I dig a little bit deeper. I do dig a little bit deeper with Sophia, for example. She actually considers her Facebook work a pastoral ministry as part of her extension of her ministry. And being in a rural area, she said that it was very helpful. Again, she's able to plant good seeds within social media. So I asked her, I said, so have you ever cut anyone off from you? And she said, I have this thing where I come back and I talk with people and I try to, but if it gets to the point where they are being very, very malicious, she says, sometimes I have to cut the ties. And I think that even in today's society, we also have to look at that as when do we have, how much of a response do we give? And Sophia was struggling with that with social network. How much of a response balancing back and forth, because she felt that she was ministering to this person as a person, not as a congregant, right? So she was struggling a little bit with social media and some of the things that come up. And I think we all do. I think anybody who has Facebook or any type of social media, and we'll talk later about that today, is that, Yeah, and we'll talk, with texting and stuff. How do you deal with that and that as a form of gossip as well?
Any other questions?
Thanks, Rachel.
Hi, Marianne.
As somebody who witnessed going past the Gordon room on certain days when she was had all these little pieces of paper and she was lining them up and making rows and things, I'm looking in and going, oh, Rachel. It was great. My question is, was there anything in your research that you came across that surprised you?
I was completely surprised. I really thought when I developed my research question that someone would say to me, my relationship with God was completely affected. I just turned away from God completely. I really did think I would get somebody saying that. No one, the blame was on humanity and humanity's response. No one blamed God. They questioned, where is God in this? There was those questions, what would Jesus say about this? Where was God in this? And I really did think I'd get this epiphany of someone saying, yes, church gossip made me turn away from God. They turned away from the church, from that church denomination. They looked for other denominations where they felt there was a community, a true community. That's what they did. But their relationship with God and their spiritual connection with God, that wasn't affected. So that surprised me. I really thought I would get that, but I didn't.
All right, well, I'm sure there are more burning questions, but you can check with Rachel afterwards in the tea and cookie room, which is right across the hall. Yeah, we'll gossip some more with you. So there will be a 10-minute break. Please return promptly because we're going to have a sizzling next presentation on hot preaching. You won't want to miss that one. So 10 minutes. You will see that there are peach-colored pieces of paper evaluations. These are immensely helpful to our students. Any feedback that you can give them or suggestions or for further research.
Yes.
What's the next step? So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
See you in a minute.